Hey everyone, welcome to the show today. I'm here again, honored guest, Spencer Klavan. Spencer was on last video I actually produced, and we were talking about his book, How to Save the West. I no longer have it in my office. It's at my house now. But, if you want to look up the picture, you can. But even more so, if you want to read it, which again, I strongly recommend, please go ahead and buy a copy at really wherever books are sold. Again, today we're not actually going to discuss Spencer's book. I mean, we might in some way touch upon the themes that he wrote about in the book, but today we're actually going to just really sit down as two men, as two friends, as two Christians who are discussing, really, in my opinion, the greatest season that we have. Not only, I mean, I think the greatest season, not only in the realm of Christianity, but just in the realm of life. I mean, this is my favorite season, and that is Lent. Yeah, so if you're privy to this, I'm sure a lot of people who are watching this are. Lent started last Wednesday for really the Catholic Church and some in Protestant denominations too, not for the Eastern Orthodox, but because we don't have anyone representing us from Eastern Orthodoxy today, we're just going to talk about it in the Catholic and Protestant perspective. And so, yeah, Lent started last Wednesday, February 22nd, and it runs until right. We celebrate Easter, which I believe this year is April 9th. And it actually ends a couple days before that, but regardless, I'm not gonna bother us with the calendar of it all. Spencer and I are going to talk today about Lent, why it is so important in the Christian faith, why is it so important that you should really be excited and obligate yourself to having a good Lenten journey. We're going to discuss how the Catholics celebrate it, how the Protestants celebrate it, any overlapping, which there is a lot, but also some differences, which there are some. And from there, we're going to just get into the weeds of it all. So, Spencer, so glad to have you on again, my friend. Thank you so much. You're doing well.
Yeah, it's great to be back. Thanks for having me. And I am doing well. I too love Lent. And we were talking off mic about, I'm hoping that we can kind of like wrestle with some things together about it. Because, I mean, maybe people who are listening to this podcast will all know already, but I think in general, in the world at large, not everybody understands that this is the pinnacle of the liturgical year. Like the Christian calendar finds its height here, and this is the lead up to it. I mean, the typical thing I think is to think of like Christmas as the major Christian holiday because it's most visible in the public eye, and we all like get time off from work and school and stuff. But in point of fact, right, it's like you end with Christ the King. You begin with the nativity, and then it's like we're always on this path to this moment, which is going to culminate in the crucifixion and the triduum and it's such a beautiful structure, and even just that alone, having a kind of architecture that is layered through time, that your days aren't just one after the other. Everybody has some kind of liturgical calendar, whether they know it or not. Like everybody, even if they're secular people, everybody like marks the time. But this is, I think, the most beautiful. It's like using time as the language or the medium of symbolism is really wonderful.
So true, and I love the way you put it, and I would say, just to stem off that really quickly, yeah, if you are an appreciator of beauty, really, a secular Christian, whatever, if you really are if you are someone who really looks at life as, important timestamps, right? If you're someone who defines your life by important moments, which should be everyone, but unfortunately it's not, yeah, you will appreciate how this season progresses. And yes, it really does. This Lent is it's the preparatory stage, and then finally you're culminating your spirituality. It culminates in you trying to not perfect. I mean, really, I guess the goal, right, is to perfect your greatest spiritual self, or who you can be spiritually in the greatest possible way. we can as humans. And, you know, it's just, well, again, we'll get into it, but it's just, I'm just really excited to talk to you about this because sometimes I feel like people don't have a full grip into the importance of Lent, or they look at it simply as something that lasts for 40 days, it ends on Easter, and then you just get back to ordinary time, and then you just get back to your regular life. But no, I mean, it should be something that grips you, and this should be something that you carry on. You carry these practices, you carry these ways of being into ordinary time. And the next Lent, what you're going to do is you're just going to you're going to try to level up from where you were last year, right? So it's this continuation of just trying to perfect your spirituality. So
Yeah, I mean, I think of all of these lines from scripture. I mean, when Jesus is talking about like a good measure shaken and packed together is given back to you, or the prophets, try me and see if I don't open the floodgates. It's like Lent is just the quintessential example of one of those things that as you cannot, as much as you pour into it, as much as of yourself as you give to it, you will get that much back. So it's really not, to me at least, it's less about having, meeting some threshold or obligation. It's like, did I give up enough or whatever? It's like you are actually, because Easter itself will take on as much meaning as you yourself load it with by loading Lent with sacrifice and alms and all the stuff that I'm sure we'll talk about. That's been my experience of it. At least it's less that you have this kind of like threshold to meet, and more that there is just an infinite expanse of significance that you can like dive into, and the more like devotion and attention you pay to it, the more you get out of it. Maybe we should like get into some nitty gritty stuff. I know you've got like an outline or just a sort of general things you like to talk about. But...
Yeah, let's get into the weeds of it all now. So I think a great place to start would be to ask you, Spencer, what in the umbrella of Christianity, what denomination are you? People on this channel know that I'm a rotten papist, so that's already established, right? For better or worse, my devotion belongs to Pope Francis.
Ooh,
and
I don't envy you that, my friend, but there we go.
Yeah, I wish it wasn't the case, but it is what it is. But you are not. You do not have to bow down to. You're not bowing down to Pope Francis.
I don't have to kiss the ring of the whore of Babylon or whatever, whatever terrible thing. No, I'm actually like I'm one of those guys that if I weren't not a Catholic, I would be a Catholic, which is a silly thing to say. It doesn't make any sense, but like there's only very, very few things that really keep me from being a Catholic. So, in some sense, I'm going to be a bad representative of like the hardcore Prot line, although I will attempt to gesture toward it. Cool. First of all, to answer your question, I was baptized into the Episcopal Church, which is like if you think you have to be embarrassed about claiming Pope Francis, just imagine what it's like to have to claim the Episcopal Church.
That's so
already feel so much better, because the Episcopal Church is like sort of dithered into madness, but there is this kind of wing of not just the Episcopal Church, but the Anglican Communion, which is what you might call high Anglican or even Catholic, that's very comfortable with liturgy. It doesn't actually spring out of quite the same theological impulses that, say, Calvinism or Reformed theology or Lutheranism. Those all, in my mind, and again, I'm speaking with no expertise here, just in a very kind of subjective way, in my mind, like those traditions are similarly, they share in common a kind of suspicion of ritual, of liturgy, and I get the feeling that things like the imposition of ashes on Ash Wednesday, the kind of ritualistic, practice of Lent, and all of that sort of veers uncomfortably close to idolatry for a certain stamp of Protestant. And I would say that I've never really been that guy. I did have like a lot of people, I experimented in college. I dabbled in some more kind of charismatic churches in grad school, especially. But I've always really been drawn to liturgy, and because of what we mentioned, we might touch on my book, like in the crisis of meaning section of my book, I talk about symbols and the inescapability of them. And because of what I believe about symbols, there's really no way for me to get away from some kind of liturgy. So I was very much kind of taught and trained in a tradition that I think would be very recognizable to you. You go on Ash Wednesday, you put the ashes on the forehead, you remember that you were dust, you spend those 40 days in, and this is something that I want to earmark, you spend those 40 days in something. What exactly is, like, we should talk about. Yes. But you spend those 40 days in some kind of, self-denial, ascesis, however you want to put it. And then the Triduum happens, the 3-day kind of festival of, Good Friday into Easter.
And in your tradition, do you, so you referenced that, do you have a ritual on Holy Thursday? Or is that just like something that the Catholics are going to do? I know some in Catholic tradition, we celebrate a Mass, Holy Thursday Mass, where we, recognize and celebrate the Last Supper. You even have parishes who will do a washing of the feet ceremony, where you get your feet washed, which is always something, as you grow, when you're a kid, I was thinking, like, what the hell is this? But as you get older, I actually do appreciate, I appreciate the ritual of it all. I really do. I've actually never done it, but I appreciate the ritual in it. So I was just curious. So is it for you? Because right now, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, are attending what type of church?
Oh, right. So I'm now at a Presbyterian, a PCUSA.
PCUSA.
And that's the result of a number of factors, one of which, not the only one of which, is that in a place like Nashville, I do think that one part of church is to put you in communion with the body of Christ, with your actual fellow Christians.
Sure.
And it's that there aren't actual fellow Christians who are Anglicans in Nashville, but the kind of whole tenor of the church is in the kind of Presbyterian and generally sort of a little bit more American Protestant area. Okay. And so the church that and because I am not like married in any real convicted sense to a particular denomination, in fact, I think we're pretty much called by Paul to not be like of Paul and of Silas and of the, I sort of think that, so I sort of don't really believe in like hammering into. So I ended up at the church that made the most sense, that aligned most closely with what I actually believe and seemed to be preaching the creed and all of that, was a Presbyterian church, Westminster Pres, and I really love it there. But to answer your question about Holy Thursday, so I have been to only one foot washing ceremony in my experience, in my life as a Christian. And that was a Catholic church that I attended for some time at Yale in college. I also, though, at Oxford, I was a member of or involved in the various chapels, which are the kind of they're sort of associated with the various colleges, and often they have a Church of England minister, although sometimes not. But at one of them, there had once been a foot washing ceremony.
Yeah.
That like one of the previous chaplains had proposed, and this was remembered with great kind of angst and alarm among the British, because it was just kind of very like physical and uncomfortable. And but I agree with you that like the physicality of it, I think, becomes more and more important. I mean, I guess one way of putting this is just like the Eucharist is kind of everything to me. And the Eucharist is an embodiment, and all the other kinds of embodiment seem to me to kind of arise out of that. Yeah. And I think that embodiment actually is like inescapable and really important. So yeah, I have been to a foot washing ceremony. I think that my Presbyterian church will have a Holy Thursday service of some kind. Definitely there will be Good Friday services, and obviously Easter. And I don't think that on Saturday, I mean, usually you keep vigil or something, but I don't think we will be having services. I could be wrong.
Sure. Well, that's really good to know. And that actually touches even on some differences, like liturgically speaking, between, how me and you celebrate our Christianity.
Yeah.
Let's get out of the liturgy for a second. And let's circle to, well, you brought it up a few times, maybe without even knowing it. I alluded to it a couple times. Let's talk about the purpose. Like, why the hell are we even doing this, right? And so
Yes.
the way you have brought it up, I wrote some things down. You just said that, you talked about embodiment. You talked about how the Eucharist, right, that embodiment reality, that embodying reality is most important to you. And what's the purpose of Lent? You kind of were just, when you were just talking, you were open to hearing my opinion on that, it seemed like. And yeah, I mean, what is the purpose of Lent? What exactly are we doing? I mean, we as Christians, right, we step into this incarnational reality, right? So like that's I mean, without accepting that claim, I mean, we're not actually like living truly the ethos of the Christian faith. So, as Christians, what we're called to do, in my opinion, I think this would be in the opinion of a lot of people, right, is to embody, right,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
imitate. I mean, we are in, this is an incarnational practice, so that means that we have to have some like kinetic expression of this all, and this is what Lent is doing, right? So it's, the way that I think of Lent is that, yeah, we're embodying in a biblical sense, right? And I think the most like basic way that a lot of people would say it would say, oh, well, yeah, when we're kind of like acting out, the 40 days that Christ was in the desert, right? And then yes, that's true. That is like a good way to think about it. But we shouldn't just keep it there. That should not be the only thing that we state. It's like, yes, we are. So, but what exactly was Christ doing in the desert? And why is that important for us? You mentioned it before. It's like, you are going to have a greater Easter, right? You are personally going to have a greater resurrection on Easter if dependent on how much you put out into your Lenten journey, into your Lenten experience. And that's really what I think Lent is all about. It's about emptying yourself, right? So you have to empty yourself into Christ. You have to really put yourself, we're not just talking. We have to like try to really realize, we have to like blur the realities here. And we have to say, like, no, we are not just like figuratively imitating the life of Christ. We need to like blur this, we need to blur this and say, for 40 days, I am going to empty myself out into Christ while Christ was in the desert. I need to put myself, truly, I need to think of myself as if I was with Christ in that desert, right? If he's going to die for my sins, I need to have a little stake in this game. So I have to I need to put myself into Christ while in the desert and while being tempted. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
we need to we need to embody Christ. We need to empty ourselves out into Christ. And in a way, and again, I'm sure you're okay with this, and people probably watching this are going to be like, wow, that sounds like super heretical, but I don't really care about that. But in a way, you need to take on the character. You need to be like Christ. You need to be more like Christ. In the Catholic tradition, there is a beautiful Lenten experiential prayer simply called the Imitation of Christ.
Yeah,
And
imitatio Christi is like totally a thing. Yes, I mean, this is, I don't mean to interrupt you.
no, please,
I
this
just
is
think this
good. I
is
just
so
wanted
rich
to
what you're
be.
saying. I mean, like, yes, there are some people I think who would hear us talking this way and accuse us of pride or heresy or idolatry, right? But actually, it's like, if we're serious about the extraordinary nature of what God has done in Christ, it's like this is the gift that we are called
Yes.
upon and invited to claim. I mean, I love what you were saying about like blurring the distinction between the literal and the real,
Yeah.
because it's sort of, Christ's life is perfect symbol in that the signifier and the signified are united. And in that sense, at least, like, he's what we're all supposed to be. So we all know we're not really doing that. We all know that we do the things we don't want to do. We don't do the things we want to do. Our outward lives don't really conform to like the inward sense of self we have. And yet, in Christ, I think we are told like we will have that given back to us. That alignment is like, if we follow him, if we imitate him, if we
Yep.
try to be like little Christs, um, and what's really rich about the whole kind of 40 days in the desert thing, because yeah, like that's the passage everybody reads, Matthew 4, I guess. I'm gonna get it wrong, but Matthew something. He goes into the desert, and he's led by the Spirit. He's tempted by the devil, and it's like true. We are following him through those temptations insofar as we can, but those temptations were also themselves symbolic in a sense, or they were emblematic of like larger experiences that we are actually having. So it's like, okay, he's hungry, the devil offers him bread. Well, okay, we all have physical desires, right? I mean, this is kind of like the core embodiment of what it is to like deny the fulfillment of physical desire, which is one thing that we might do during Lent. We might like give up caffeine or take up fasting or whatever. But then you can go further. There's like other temptations after those have been denied. Like, in fact, the appetitive soul is only the most rudimentary part of the soul. And we then go on into like a kind of thumatic temptation, you might say, which is like to cast yourself down upon the stone and like let God just let your father intervene, right? So then, or there's maybe this is more of a spiritual temptation, I don't know. And then you have the kind of temptation to power, right? To glory and to the dominion over all things. And I mean, each of these is something that we might kind of examine in ourselves in ways that we certainly give into these temptations all the time, right? And how we might develop a practice of kind of encountering. I mean, Lewis has this beautiful line, like encountering temptation and resisting it is actually how you come to know the full nature of it in yourself and in the world. So I definitely think that like all of these practices are, yeah, they're symbolic of the light of the meeting in the or of the temptation in the desert, but because the temptation in the desert was already a prefiguration of everything every temptation we might ever suffer, they're actually not symbolic. They are the temptation in the desert. Like the temptation in the desert kind of hovers over the totality of human temptation, and by entering into that, I think we also kind of are we sort of embody it as well.
Amen. I mean, the temptation in the desert is our everyday life. Like
Yeah.
we are in a constant state of being in the desert. And what
Mm.
Lent calls us to do is Lent is calling us to, for this time, to realize that our everyday life is actually the desert, that we're in this perpetual deserted state.
Mm.
And we're slobs, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we're addicted to desire, we're addicted to sex, we're addicted to all the things that make us believe that we are either other than God or not connected with God in the first place, right? And so what Lent and what the desert, with understanding what the Lenten journey is all about is, again, yeah, like I said, realizing that this is the state of our life, and it's God is inviting us truly to be conscious of this and to overcome these temptations that you just described, to empty yourself out so that you can be truly aligned with the life of Christ. And I just want, before we get into something more about temptation and what I think, maybe some things that you can do for Lent, or maybe some, even if you have some questions that you want to ask. Before I get into that, I want to go back really quick and talk about how, during Lent, it's a time where the material world and the spiritual world need to touch more. We need to combine these two worlds and really like meld them together. And it's funny, you see this all the time in movies or in television shows, in our great stories, right? There's a time period, there's like a physical period of time that exists where the spiritual world and the physical world touch.
Mm.
I was just this is a very immature example, but I was just watching with my son on Sunday. I mean, he can't understand it yet, but it's fun. He's enjoying these Disney movies, and we watched Brother Bear. I don't know if you ever seen Brother Bear, but
Sure, bro. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it was just so funny. I was thinking about how, that's very Lenten when you think about it, because in that movie,
Mm. Yeah.
you have, it's like the spiritual world is coming down to the physical world at this like one precise moment.
Mm. Mm.
And if essentially the plot is, right, he needs to go up the mountain, and he needs to interact with the spiritual world while it's blurring the lines of these realities, so he can essentially be human again. And I was just thinking, wow, this was not the point, but what a great Lenten message this is to, and that's what we should be doing, right? We should be traveling up our own spiritual mountain to truly become human again, right? And so with all that, let's get back into this idea of temptation. If you want to, maybe we can talk about temptation more. And maybe
Yeah.
we can talk about what are some practices that you should do during Lent, or, well, yeah, how about that? What are some practices that you should do during Lent? But before I get into that, I was wondering, do you have any talking points you want to get into?
Well, I think this is all, I mean, we're approaching the part where I need to use you for free therapy, because I do have some questions for you here about how you handle some of these issues.
Yeah.
But I will say, just in response to your very astute reading of the movie Brother Bear, that the world is at an inflection point between spirit and flesh, is kind of how I like to think of it. There's a passage in John Milton's Paradise Lost. I think it's the end of book 2, but it's whenever Satan is flying to see the world, the earth that God has made. And there's this wonderful phrase, he calls it this pendant world, like this world hanging by a golden chain from heaven, just at exactly the intersection between matter and soul, or whatever, however you want to put it. And I do think that is, that's not just our, calling as Christians, although it is our calling as Christians to kind of occupy that and embody it and live it out. It's also our calling as, like, it's our particular place in the created hierarchy. Like we occupy this unique and important position just in the order of all things. If you imagine, like, everything that is the seen and unseen as kind of extending infinitely up toward God, and even down into hell, it's like we are, like, that is the definition almost of what we are: rational animals, embodied souls, right? And so there are these points at which, like, we kind of have to make contact with that, and we need the symbols to do it, because of what you said earlier, that, like, the whole world is already the desert. So in order to see it, you have to kind of set aside a special little symbol or time to, like, reflect it back at itself, because otherwise it's just the air that we breathe. So this, which leads really nicely into my anxieties and therapy questions for you, because so obviously, as we've been discussing, like, Lent is the time of encountering your brokenness, of reckoning with your mortality. We sang in church on Ash Wednesday. I just joined the choir, and we sang.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's been great. And we sang a portion of Handel's Messiah, "For as in Adam all die." And it's this beautiful, it's a very short little section of the piece, which has itself been going on for like 3 hours at this point. But this particular portion has a kind of very somber, slow section, "For as in Adam all die," and then this beautifully kind of Handelian, exactly what you associate with Handel, this like bouncy English choral music, "Even so in Christ shall all be made alive," and so these two things are counterpoised, and then there's another section that just does the same thing. It's like, for, actually the first one is, "For by man came death, since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead." And so it's this counterpoise between it, from Paul, this counterpoise between Adam and Christ. And I'm really on board with all of this. And I have, as long as I've been a Christian, I've done something for Lent, but it's varied pretty wildly each year what I do. And I think the reason for that is, like, I'm not totally sure what my relationship is to the brokenness of the world. Like, on the one hand, I have a kind of fondness for the world and all of its terrible, awful problems. And for people, even though they often suck, including myself, it's like the world and its brokenness, it seems really lovely to me. And on top of that, like, the world deprives you of plenty of things already. You don't have to try. Like, you are going to get a very short countable number of days on the earth, and like many of them will involve deprivation. And so sometimes I feel like, well, okay, I've for instance, I've given up whiskey for Lent sometimes, or just
Yeah.
alcohol.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm not addicted to alcohol, so it's not in the category of thing that I should just be giving up anyway at all. And it's actually kind of a joy in my life. And so those deprivation things, sometimes it just feels like, well, what is the, like, taking on yet more suffering upon myself? Then it's like, but what if I give up something that I should just give up? Like, if I gave up smoking, let's say, I'm not a smoker, but like if I gave up smoking cigarettes, then is that really Lent? Because probably I should just give it up at full stop. Like, I should probably not make a practice out of it. Do you know what I mean? So it's hard to find a thing. And then on top of that, yeah, it's hard to find a thing to give up that makes a lot of sense,
No,
especially because I also like am a kind of obsessive self-denier in life anyway. Like, I'm
yeah.
an intermittent faster, and it's like, isn't that already kind of my temptation to like deny
Right.
myself and be proud of it and all of those things? So these are all questions that I have.
Yeah, you're just like, what I'm hearing it maybe is like, yeah, how Spartan do I need to get? Because I mean, if
Yeah.
you said, I mean, I'm already living like a Spartan lifestyle, or maybe I'm living like a semi-Spartan lifestyle where, yeah, I'm already doing the fasting. Maybe I'm already waking up and praying, and then I'm, doing some type of like physical activity. And then, I mean, yeah, it's just like, I understand what you mean. I want to go back to, I've done a lot of thinking on what you were talking about when you said, yeah, if I was a smoker, should I give up smoking?
Right.
Do I use Lent? Right. This is the question I've contemplated a lot. Do I use Lent as the Christian form of a New Year's resolution?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
And the unfortunate thing is, because in my experience, right, a lot of you learn these practices when you're a child, if you were born, right, if you're like a cradle Christian. Okay, so you learn these practices when you're a child, and if you're not a cradle Christian, you learn these practices by other cradle Christians. So I guess in some way, you're always learning these how to practice Lent
Yep.
based on the practices of the past, or the practices of a particular family. And what I've noticed is that a lot of families, a lot of individuals in general, a lot of people don't actually know what a good Lenten experience should look like, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so what ends up happening is you do end up using Lent as a Christian New Year's resolution, where I'm going to give this up. Right? I'm going to give up smoking. Or I've heard countless number of times, people, men, when I've had conversations with men about this, they go, yeah, I'm going to give up porn for Lent. And I'm like, okay, but maybe you should just give up porn,
Maybe
because
just give it up. Right. Right.
it's
Yeah.
bad for you. And I know you don't think it's bad for you, but no, it's bad for you. And it's bad. It's like totally just eroding your marriage and you as a person, and let's just give it up. Do I have a problem with people using Lent as the New Year's resolution? In general, well, I would say yes and no. Yes, because do I think that it could be the start of something good? Sure. Do I think that your intentionality, though, is going to be correct? I don't. And so that's why I ultimately would tell people to steer clear of, if you're already addicted to something, maybe don't use Lent as maybe don't use Lent as your excuse to stop this. Because I mean, again, what is the message that you're projecting out into the world, or you're projecting onto Christ, right? It's like, yeah, I mean, Christ, you're great, but you're great, and thank you for saving me, but thank you, but I'm only going to use these like 40 days to really just like look at. It's almost selfish. I'm going to take these 40 days and I'm going to work on physical self development and not spiritual self development, because 9 times out of 10, the individuals who are going to give up the alcohol, or the porn, or the cigarettes, are going to be so fixated on the fact that they're giving these things up. Because if you know anything about addiction, it's not, you just don't give these things up cold turkey, right? And
Yeah.
so they're going to be so fixated on them on the physical level of it, they're not going to actually have time to focus on the spiritual significance of giving something up, right?
Mm.
And then what's going to happen? Okay, so let's Lent's 30 days. You're more than likely, if this is an actual addiction you're struggling with, you're more than likely going to slip up, right? You're more than likely going to either have a slip up or maybe even a full-blown relapse. So now what? So now you've put all your trust into God, and usually people who do these things, meaning give up an addiction for Lent, there's going to be some like backstory behind it. They're going to pray to God intensely and say, God, please, help me rid this addiction. I'm going to use Lent. I'm going to use your journey in the desert and ultimately your crucifixion to rid myself of this. And they're going to fail. I mean, you're going to fail. I've failed. People have failed. Everyone's going to fail. Sorry that I'm being pessimistic here, but you're probably going to fail. And so what's that going to do? Well, then what message is that going to actually bounce back to you? It's like, okay, well, God, what the heck? I told you I was going to use this as a time of being free from this addiction that's in my life. Why did you not give me the courage? Why did you not give me the foresight? Why didn't you give me the strength to eradicate this? And because I say this because a lot of us have these immature conversations with God. I mean, the smartest people have these immature conversations with God, just like how I just stated, right? So it's like, God, you were supposed to do this for me. Why didn't you do this? So yeah, I would say that in general, no. I mean, I would say that I think that Lent, if you're going to give something up, it should be not something that you're addicted to, but something that you are able to give up. And then in the void of that, or every time you want to drink, every time you want to smoke, every time you want to drink a cup of coffee, right? You're realizing that, well, you're conscious of why you gave it up in the first place. And hopefully you should turn back into yourself and use that as a time of prayer. So every time I'm craving for a cup of coffee, right? So like right now, I gave up all liquids other than water and tea. And
Wow.
so, yeah. And so I love Coke Zero. I love ginger ale zero. I love my coffee, all those things. It would be pointless if I'm just, if I'm just craving these things and then it just ends there, and then I just crave it and I don't do anything about it, right? And in the Catholic tradition, what we are called to do is when we crave these things, we realize this is actually a signal that what we are craving is craving God, and then we turn that back into ourselves and use that as a time of prayer and meditation. And that's what I think you should do.
Yeah,
I don't want to monologue, so I don't know if you have any
no,
thoughts.
I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I've seen God lift people out of addictions. But the converse isn't necessarily true, that if you like use Lent as a leg up out of your addiction, like he will definitely, because it's like the special time, he will definitely do it. And that's kind of telling yourself that is kind of a recipe for disaster, because then if he doesn't do that at that time, like you'll feel a sense of despondency, because we all, like you said, everybody makes these covert contracts with
Yes,
God.
exactly.
And you have to kind of actually cure yourself of that, I think. I mean, another version of this is like, I am, as we kind of alluded to earlier, sort of addicted to asceticism. And in a very Pharisaical way, I am tempted always into the thought, like my discipline makes me sort of holier or better, or just like more like excellent, more virtuous than other people. And so to give something else up for me is maybe already like, is actually might not be the correct direction to travel in. Like I really like I think this is a Catholic triad of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving.
Yeah.
And I also like you're illustrating for me in a way I had never really quite seen before, that those three things are like intertwined. They're sort of meant to work in a network together. That when you experience that desire, you sort of like redirect that toward prayer. Maybe the prayer leads you to like more greater almsgiving. Um, one fruitful avenue that I have found, uh, sometimes, I don't always do this for Lent, but sometimes I will take one of the statements from the Sermon on the Mount, like in
Yeah.
Matthew 6, um, but you have heard it said, but I tell you statements. And I'll think about that because like I two things. I don't know what you think about that passage, but I think two things. One, uh, that they're meant to be taken in deadly earnest. They're completely serious. Like actually, even one who says to his brother, "Raka, you fool," like is liable to Gehenna,
Hmm.
and that they are impossible. And I think that those two things are both real. Like I genuinely think that you can't in this life shave your sin nature down to such a point that you never have an angry thought about your brother.
I agree.
And okay, so we're basically on the same page about
We are. Yeah.
these passages, that they are designed to illuminate the inescapable reality of your sin, because some of us have never said a nasty word to anybody in 20 years or whatever. You've never cheated on your wife. Great, excellent. That doesn't excuse you from the sin nature. Like the sin nature is there every time you have a thought about a woman passing down the street, because that just means that like in you there is that urge, that desire,
Yep.
and that's you. So sometimes I like to, for Lent, rather than like, because typically during the regular year I sort of have this set of thoughts in my head, and every now and then I will notice like, oh, there I am, like being the old Adam, like doing the inner, having the inner life that shows my sin nature. But I don't seriously then like pray for forgiveness every time, or like think
Yeah.
of that as a, so, but sometimes for Lent I will just pick one of those as my Lenten
I like it.
devotion, with the consequence that I am like literally all the time failing at my Lenten devotion. Like
Yeah.
there's no universe in which I'm going to get to the end of Lent and be like, I did it perfectly. Like I checked the box. Um, and then therefore what it is this sort of constant invitation to recognize your dependence on Christ. Like you're just like the utter hopelessness of your ever doing for yourself what Christ has done for you,
Of
namely to
course.
wipe away the sin nature. Because otherwise I just think I am, maybe like all people, I don't know, but like my particular version of this is, I suspect, like a kind of a very male version of it, that it's like I'm gonna do the thing, I'm gonna kind of like, I'm just always tricking myself into thinking I can like get perfect marks and like knock off, bust through every metric and just be the guy that did it. And if you take those kind of inner directives from the Sermon on the Mount in Lent, you can kind of disabuse yourself of that notion and start to enter more into the penitential feeling of like, oh, every time I wake up, I have a sin to acknowledge, and that means I have a source, Christ says, for more rejoicing, because that's like, if I offer it to him for forgiveness, then it's like, he who has been forgiven much loves much. So that is kind of like, that's been a practice of mine lately. I don't know
I
what you
love
think about
that.
that, but yeah,
No,
there.
I love that. It's actually such a great and rich idea, and it's
Oh,
just a great experiment. I think I'm going to do this because
give it a shot, man.
I truly believe that that is a great way of structuring your Lenten. You do not have to give something up,
Mm,
right? That's not actually what exactly we're called to do during Lent. It could be, but it could also be, taking on other things, and you demonstrate, or what you just discussed demonstrates that you're adding something. That's like another tried and true basic Catholic thing is, well, you can also add something. And yeah, I've never heard of that. I've never done that, and that's actually such a great idea.
mm,
I'm a highly competitive person. It's actually, you can ask my wife, it's probably it really, no, I mean, sincerely, like it's actually probably one of the worst personality traits that I have.
mm.
Is I'm also this way. I also kind of, I hate saying this is so cringy, but I do kind of consider myself more of this alpha male prototype, and I'm like, so I go into Lent and I'm like, I'm gonna kick Lent's ass, like I'm gonna do it
Yeah,
so good.
totally.
You know what I mean? Like
I'm gonna Lent harder than anybody ever
yeah,
lented.
that's
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
it's sad because actually, honest to God, that's sometimes what I think, even today, right?
Yep.
It's like, oh man, look what I did. And that just goes back, and that just, again, that's desire, right? We're desiring to be better than someone else. And, a prayer that I've been conducting this Lent is, Christ, I go through a list of things, and I say, or I go through a list of desires, and I pray that, I desire that people are better than me. I desire that people have a better Lent than me. I pray that I desire that people, it's more like affirmative desires. So I've been
Yeah.
doing that because, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if that's your perspective on it, and you can get caught up in those crosshairs when I'm going to give up this. I'm gonna go to the gym at 4:30, and I'm gonna lift for Christ. Which again, I have actually been. I unfortunately have also done that,
I
or
don't think that's necessarily inherently cringe. Just to I don't think that's inherently cringe. It's you're probably right that it's not the right like Lenten
it's not the right, but
mindset.
yeah.
But I always see that like on Instagram sometimes and get advertisements for like Christian workout gear. And my
Yeah.
feeling is like, well, at least it's not like, flimsy Christianity. At least it's a Christianity that has like space for kind of strength and self improvement, whatever. But I
No,
totally
no.
get what you're saying.
I appreciate that. And so again, it comes back to like, okay, how can we blur these realities, and how can we enter into an even greater relationship with God? How can we and really I go back, I want to state that it's really all about prayer. So how can we make our prayer life more serious? How can we make our communication with God not a monologue but a dialogue, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what prayer should be. I mean, really, my favorite Catholic theologian, probably just Christian theologian in general, and I truly recommend you picking this book up and reading it. And everyone who's watching, I truly recommend. It's a little dense, but you'll be okay. Hans Urs von Balthasar. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
Yeah. Somehow I have, I think.
Yeah, he actually writes tons about beauty.
Yeah.
Tons. Yeah. So he's he mostly spent a lot of his academic work talking about Christian aesthetics, and he wrote a book just called On Prayer. And it's a really great book to try to make your prayer life and your communication with God more serious. Because oftentimes how we structure our prayer life is a monologue, and it's this like call and response structure. It's like, God, I need this. God, let's do this for me. And because communication with God only works in silence, right? In the contemplative, because we do not spend that many moments in contemplation in our everyday lives, we usually don't hear what God is sincerely telling us. Because I truly believe that actually, no, you hear, God does speak to you. Obviously, I believe that. And I believe that it's actually more overt than we like to think it is. But again, we just don't spend these times in contemplative prayer. And maybe that's an additive, right? So maybe I think spending 5, 10, 15 minutes in contemplative prayer could really benefit every single person here. What I've been doing is I've been waking up in the mornings, and I've been doing this Jesuit practice because unfortunately, for better or most of the time for worse, my training has come from the Jesuits. So I sometimes disdain it, but they hold a special place in my heart. And what I've been doing is I have been meditating on an image every morning. It's been the same image. And the image that I'm meditating on is Christ actually being crucified. So I'm trying to, and I'm not talking like, oh, I'm thinking about an artistic rendition of this. No, I'm actually trying to assert myself watching a Jewish man, right? A dark, swarthy Jewish man being crucified. I'm trying to actually contemplate what it would look like physically, just like nails being just pierced through hands and through feet. And it's a rather like gruesome thing, don't get me wrong, because when we do these practices, again, what we usually do is we think of like some artistic rendition of the crucifixion, right?
Right.
We oftentimes don't try to make it in physical form, in true flesh. And so, yeah, that's what I've been trying to do. I've been trying to spend 15 minutes each day, usually in the mornings, trying to think of what it actually looked like when Christ was dying.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and again, that opens me up, though. It opens me up to having a greater connection with Christ. Because when we can connect with Christ as the person, when we can actually like realize that Christ was 100% man, he was actually a man.
Yeah.
Um, I think that it it allows you to buy into it more. It allows you to buy into this message more. When we think that Christ is just like a painting or a cartoon character, it's well, that if that's what our attention is going towards, well, then we're going to think about this faith and this journey in, I think, more immature ways, or in more
Mm.
fictional ways, right? When we are only functioning in the fictional and not the
Hmm.
non-fictional, it does something to our prayer life and it does something to our spirituality, I think.
Yeah. Oh, wow. No, it's very affecting just to even hear about it. And I suspect, the yeah, when people talk about Lectio Divina or
Yeah,
contemplation, I think it often does kind of take the form of like a medieval manuscript or something
yeah,
that they've kind of got vaguely in their heads. And I know I do that for
yeah,
sure. But of course, the medieval manuscripts are themselves depictions of a thing, right? So what you really should be doing is trying to picture the thing itself. And I think what you say about listening is so important. I mean, I'm very chatty in prayer, and I often forget, like, oh, just like shut up for a second, because you've actually now said a bunch and asked a bunch of things, and answers do come. They come like, even I suspect, um, because God's interaction with us, much, any supernatural, let's say any supernatural experience that we have is going to be mediated through nature. I mean, this is something
yes, right.
I feel very strongly, with the exception of some genuine miracles, which I do believe in, but I don't think they're all that common. Um, you encounter the divine, you encounter what is beyond nature in and through the symbolic properties of nature and of the material world. And so much of the answer to prayer that I know of and think of comes out of like, oh, I just happened to notice some guy walking down the street with a t-shirt on that sort of answered exactly the question that I had, even though it was unintentional. Or like these weird little mystic experiences out of the corner of your eye. Just this morning, for instance, I was working very intensely on a particular piece of writing. And I was like in that moment where um like the you both feel like this is really hard to kind of nail this thing down. I mean, this is like shop talk a little bit maybe, but like if people who are listening are writers, they will know like there's this moment where it's really hard to nail the thing down. But the reason it's hard is because you're right on it. Like this is the crux of the issue. You've got to find like the words for it. And so you both have the feeling like, should I just give this thing up altogether? Because like it's just hopeless. I've taken on the wrong project. And like I really want to do this. And so at that moment, at that time, I just sort of asked God for um for encouragement. And I sort of prayed that briefly and then kept working. And in the course of working, a few things happened where like my cursor landed just in exactly the spot on the page that I had associated with like, the or like for instance, I hit a footnote and it was footnote 77, it's like this kind of like divine number. And I I then finished the chapter, and afterward I was like, wow, all that stuff kind of happened. I was encouraged in that moment, and I didn't even notice it as an answer to my prayer. Like I didn't even connect the two events, that I had prayed for encouragement and that then I became encouraged by all these sorts of subsequent little minor things. And in order to notice that, to do that, like noticing, you have to have moments of like prayer and contemplation. I guess is the moral of the story, is like, in order to notice, you have to pray. And prayer, perhaps in large part, just is like the discipline of noticing, of like being able to see that this stuff is going on all around you all the time. Because otherwise you're just so in it that you don't pay attention.
Yeah, no, so it's funny because we started off and I talked about how, Lent is a time or Lent is a season where these two worlds meet. But we only realize that they meet because for these 40 days plus, the Easter season, we're conscious that they could meet, right? That they have the possibility of meeting. But you said something that I actually very much agree with, and that is, well, actually, these worlds are always meeting, and we're always actually. So this is not like a special. It's when I say special, I mean like this is not just like a once in a calendar year season, right? Where these two worlds meet. It doesn't work like that. It's actually these God is again to borrow from Ignatian spirituality, right? I mean, God exists in every single thing, and therefore, right? I mean, we can just notice God in anything. I mean, we really can. I mean, God is always, since God is in everything, we can notice God in everything. And what you just said, I mean, I think I personally actually believe sincerely, like that. I think that's how it works too. I think that's how prayer works. I've had so many moments in my life all the time where I'm struggling with something, and then my wife texts me just like, hey, and it's just like, oh, why did she text me at this particular time?
Yeah.
Or it's or you said like, yeah, I'm walking down the street and I see a t-shirt with a symbol or a sentence that is exactly what I needed to see. I don't think these things are coincidences. I really don't. I think this is exactly how prayer works. And again, it goes back to attention, right? Right attention is it's the most important thing that we can. It's like the greatest virtue that we can have is right attention, right? And so what our Lent should be is, take these 40 days to tune our attention, right? Just like how like you need to tune up a piano, you need to tune a car, you need to tune up a guitar. We are truly the instrument that needs to be tuned up, right? And that's how we need to practice Lent, is that we need to look at ourselves truly as an instrument, right? We're the instrument of God, and we need a tune up. And that's what we should do. We should get our attention in the correct order. And like all humans, we're going to sin. We have that proclivity to sin. And yeah, 9 times out of 10, unless, me and you, Spencer, are going to become saints, which probably doubt it. We don't necessarily need that tune up, but in another year, right? We're gonna need that tune up. Our oil is gonna be really dirty, and we're gonna need that tune up pretty badly. So I guess that's maybe a cool analogy. That's a good analogy to understand it by.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. I mean, I think actually, I mean, since there's literally no chance of my being a saint, I think we can put that off the table. But if we were saints, one thing that I really like about a lot of I mean, Augustine has passages about this, but there are others as well, that actually the more you progress in the Christian life, it entails knowing your sinfulness more and more.
Yeah.
So even getting quote unquote better at being a Christian or whatever, actually feels like getting worse and worse at it. It feels like really discouraging. Except that, God also offers this thought in consolation, which is like, yeah, that knowledge is actually like his gift to you, just as Lent is his gift to you, like to make you aware, is to open your eyes, to throw you at the feet of the cross. And also, since he has provided the cross, to like redouble and triplicate your joy. I mean, that's the whole point of it. That it's, but it does sort of feel like, oh man, I have to like tune up the instrument again. But yeah, you totally do. You totally do. I mean, that's like that's progress.
Well, I guess I've ordered it before, but no reason to get into the order now. But like probably my favorite musical artist of all time is Paul Simon.
Okay.
And in Obvious Child, he has this line. He talks about how the cross is in the ballpark. And I
No,
don't know if you're familiar with Paul Simon. I mean, obviously you're familiar with Paul Simon, but everyone is. But I don't know if you're a listener to Paul Simon.
not really. No. Yeah.
Yeah, I love him. But yeah, he talks about how the cross is in the ballpark, and I've always like thought
Ah,
like, what the hell does that mean?
yeah.
And you made sense of it actually to me by your explanation. You said
Ah,
he also gives us the cross, and it's just like, yeah, the cross is in the ballpark. When you say something is in the ballpark, it's within your doing. Like you can
mm,
achieve it. Like, oh yeah, no, it's in the ballpark. Like, yeah, or a ballpark, and whatever. And the cross, obviously, the symbol of all suffering, of all sin, right? I mean, that's what
mm,
the cross is a representation of. And yeah, it's like, yeah, we sin and we have a lot of suffering, but being more with Christ in this life is in the ballpark. It's doable. We can actually, this is something that we should not shy away from.
mm,
Yes, if when we progress in this Christian faith, are we going to feel more and more like sinners, and are we going to feel more negative emotions? Yes, but let's not shy away from those negative emotions, because it is very possible, right? I mean, the saints are real. It is very possible to be in a state of grace in
mm,
this, literally during this lifetime, with the flesh that we have. We can enter in an even greater state of grace than we can even imagine. Again, it's just so deterring because so many people are just so petrified of sitting in hell, to put it, just sitting with these negative emotions, to sit with this distress, to sit with this unknowing.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess what I would like say to such people, including myself, is that like those emotions are there. The sin is there. The grief is there. Like you're not making it go away by looking away from it. And so you think like, oh, this dark, pessimistic season of Lent, but actually it's an incredibly liberating thing to be like, oh, I can acknowledge that about the world and about myself, that there's these really ugly, messy parts. And actually, like, I am weirdly like, I have a God that delights in my knowing it. And so then, like, even my sorrows are in some sense a source of joy because they're a source of truth. And like, what is greater than that? It's just like, yeah, it's a very, very beautiful thing. And people, I become increasingly convinced with each passing year that people should do Lent. They should do Lent.
That's I guess that's our final message. Just please do lend people. It's funny because I just feel like this was like a pre-conversation to a conversation that's probably could get a lot more deeper. But due to time, we need to end. Spencer, I hope, man, it would be great if this Lent I could either go down to Nashville or you can come up to Cleveland. We can get to a fish fry together.
Yeah, man, that'd be awesome. It's always so great to talk to you, and yeah, I feel better. I feel more gung ho on Lent after this conversation. But yeah, there's so much more to say. So until next time.
Lovely. Okay, until then, I'll see you.
All right, brother.